This scene in A New Hope has always struck me as one of the greatest scenes in Star Wars fiction. Luke feels trapped in this plain, boring, desolate locale, a place that through its use of dark browns and washed out beiges is to the audience just as hopeless and plain as Luke's barely discernible tattered robes. And yet Luke looks off into the distance and sees these two juxtaposed pops of color, burning oranges and pinks, and we wonder, just like Luke, about how wonderful what's out there must be. But if I take this scene and I remove the color from it, suddenly it loses all of its appeal, it loses its meaning. Suddenly, it's not so easy to ascertain what Luke is thinking, what we should feel, or why this sequence exists. We see the inverse of this in Rogue One, where in the opening, the green of life and home represents freedom, while the washed out grays of the sky, and in turn, the galaxy, represent a prison. Star Wars is a world built in color, and in so many ways, it's this lens through which we view it. I saw an article recently from 2015 in which Fox took the first 6 Star Wars films and ran them through a program designed to isolate the dominant colors of the films and place them on their own color strip from beginning to end. And what we see when we look at the results of this is that while there's a dichotomy of colors, they all move from brighter to dark, and in the case of Revenge of the Sith, to redder hues. This is a simple, very basic way of approaching color in film. Things start bright and cheery and lead to dark, brutal climaxes. That is not just unsurprising, but expected. What's far more interesting is the nuance in these particular layers. Take this sequence here, with Luke and Yoda on Dagobah from Empire Strikes Back. In the original trilogy, the Force is a part of nature, a naturally occurring phenomena that balances the universe. Yoda and Dagobah both are washed with greens of every hue, a color that throughout Star Wars represents life, that thing that the Force coexists with. Yoda himself and Dagobah are overrun by nature, and Dagobah's green color palette is used to elicit that feeling of life in balance. It's how we know Yoda can be trusted, it's how we know he's good. And that green hue and its representation of life would appear again in The Force Awakens on TAKODANA. But what I think is more interesting is the way Star Wars uses color to inform character. This still image is what lightsaber blades look like throughout most of the film's production. Bright, white lights. The color is added at the very end, after a lengthy process of understanding what that color should be. Ralph McQuarrie had the idea to personalize the sabers to the personality. He wanted the sabers to match the individual, to match the Jedi. But sometimes it's even more simple than that. Luke's lightsaber was originally blue, but that didn't stand out enough in this particular scene, and so it was changed in post, in Return of the Jedi. That bright green hue sharply contrasting with his surroundings. In this scene, the color of Luke's saber seems to represent just how special and unique Luke is on a planet all but devoid of those very adjectives. But the green also fittingly represents the goodness in Luke. That simplicity holds meaning. And yet in Star Wars lore, lightsabers are powered by kyber crystals that are bonded with Force users. But the Sith, well, their red sabers are a bit more interesting than bad guy is bad. See, the Sith can't bond with the kyber crystals, so they have to, as some have put it, make those crystals bleed. And to do that, they must, as Sean Keane once worded it, channel all of their anger, all of their frustration into the crystal. That's what turns it red. When you see a red saber, you don't just see a bad guy, you see hurt, anguish, pain, and importantly, fury. When we see Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace, we don't just know that the nearly wordless character is evil. We don't need exposition to tell us that. We know, thanks to his saber, that he's tortured. Its color tells us that. But it's this scene that I think best utilizes lightsabers and their colors to full effect. Well, and I guess this scene as well. In these two scenes, the blades become the only real color we, the viewer, see, or better yet, are meant to focus on. They are where our eyes are almost exclusively drawn. The duels break down a simple reality, these two in particular, one that underlines the entire Star Wars universe. Good versus bad, light versus dark. After all the pomp and circumstance, color is the way Star Wars most often chooses to signify the battles it places in front of us. color is the way this universe wants us to view its characters. However, I believe that Star Wars' use of color is at its best when it's used on a larger scale to express emotion. Alexander Hulse once wrote about this moment, on his way to find his kidnapped and tortured mother. It is in this moment that Anakin's journey undergoes its most monumental shift. As this fiery red sunset washes the screen, those oranges and bright reds are used as an articulation of Anakin's emotion, his anger, his rage, and those reds and oranges also aptly mark his transition from the light to the dark side, as the sun goes from day to the dark of night. And upon arrival, all that rage will come to a head. While the prequels are often thrashed, it's hard to ignore their accomplishments when they're burning through your screen, when you can feel Anakin, feel his emotion through nothing but one element of what's happening in front of you. This is why throughout Star Wars, dirt or sand planets become so important. Often, they represent from a color perspective, a middle ground. The yellows, those muted yellows, in between the red and blue, the neutral moment in between those two choices. The mood of the unknown, those yellows and those planets are where Luke's journey begins, before he's chosen or found a side. Same with Anakin and even Rey. These yellows and browns are the baseline of Star Wars color palette, and the baseline of Star Wars' characters. We see this again returning to Dagobah, where the inside of Yoda's hut returns to those beiges, washed out browns of Tatooine, a color palette that adds to a familiarity, a bond of color that allows Luke to feel a moment of comfort, almost like he's back at home. And to me, I think that's kind of the job of a series like Star Wars. Articulating understanding, familiarity. When you're building a world as unfamiliar as this galaxy, rules can sometimes seem meaningless. But without them being written and without them being created, your world falls into chaos, narratively, visually, thematically. Inconsistencies without those rules are what runs so many sci-fi stories off the rails. You sit down and you ask yourself, why are the Rebels' ship blasters red and TIE fighters, and even the Death Stars green? Well, it's surmised that green energy was more powerful and more expensive, and the red of the Rebel ship's blasters represents their scrappy, impoverished situation. These questions should always have an answer. Rules like these are what make universes feel alive. And for Star Wars, it's color. So many of these rules are made. So when the sun sets and the world darkens and nothing but the glow of lightsabers is left, it's color that brings the story to life. Well guys, that is it for today's episode of Nerdstalgic. If you enjoyed this episode, press that like button. If you haven't yet done so, also press subscribe. That way you don't miss any of the videos I put out. I am indeed back. If you want to make sure you really don't miss anything I put out, hit that little bell next to the subscribe button. That'll make sure that when I put something out, you'll be the first one to know that it's actually come out. And as always, on your screen right now are 2 more episodes of Nerdstalgic. You can click on either of those to see more of what I've done recently. I came back with the Billy and Mandy video just a couple days ago, so you can check that out if you're interested. And I will see you guys in the next video.